Jebediah Kane was a man made of prairie dust and silence. His ranch was a lonely island in a sea of sun-scorched grass. The house stood tired, its windows like old eyes staring out at nothing. Jeb liked the nothing. It was predictable. It was safe. He sat on his porch, a giant of a man who'd learned to move slow so he didn't break things, watching the road. His dog, Scout, dozed at his feet. Trouble rarely came this far out. But on that day, trouble was walking. He saw her first as a shimmer in the heat, a dark speck moving on the horizon. Not a horse, not a wagon, just a person, alone, walking straight toward his ranch. He stood up without meaning to. Scout let out a single low bark. As she got closer, he could see the details. A patched dress, a small bag clutched like a prayer book. She walked like every step might be her last, head down, shoulders tight. She looked like she was braced for a storm even though the sky was clear and blue. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, dust caked on her cheeks. When she looked up, her eyes hit him like a physical blow, gray-green and watchful. She wasn't looking at him like a man. She was looking at him like a map, trying to find a safe road. "Mr. Kane?" Her voice was a whisper, but it didn't break. "That's me," he said, his own voice rusty from disuse. "My name is Rose McKenna. I came about the cook position." Jeb blinked. The notice he'd posted in town was weeks old. He'd forgotten all about it. He never expected anyone to answer, especially not a woman who looked like she'd walked through hell to get here. He noticed her sleeves were buttoned tight at the wrist, despite the blistering heat. He noticed she flinched when Scout trotted over to sniff her. "You cook?" he asked. It was a dumb question. A flicker of something, hurt, maybe, crossed her face. "I can." "Then you're hired," he said. The words came out before he could think about them. Something in him screamed to offer this woman shelter first, and ask questions later. Maybe never. "House is big enough. Kitchen's yours." Relief washed over her face, but it was gone in a second, replaced by that same guarded watchfulness. She hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at the empty road she'd just walked. It was the look of a person checking to see if they were being followed. And that's when he knew. This wasn't a cook looking for a job. This was a woman running from something terrible. That night, the house felt different. Alive with small sounds. The clink of a pot, the squeak of the water pump. Jeb sat on the porch listening, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. He was a man who liked his quiet, his solitude. But the sounds from his kitchen didn't feel like an intrusion. They felt right. He told himself it was just nice to have a hot meal coming. But it was more than that. It was the sound of another life in his empty house. The next morning, the smell of coffee and frying bacon woke him before the sun. Rose was at the stove, her back to him. She still wore those long sleeves. She moved like a shadow, efficient and quiet. He ate the best biscuits he'd ever tasted without saying a word. She ate nothing, just stood by the stove, watching him. When he pushed his clean plate back, her shoulders seemed to relax, just a fraction. It was like she'd been waiting for a verdict. Days turned into a week. A quiet rhythm settled over the ranch. Jeb mended fences. Rose cooked, cleaned, and started coaxing a garden back to life from a patch of weeds. They barely spoke, but a different kind of language grew between them. He'd leave a bucket of fresh well water on the back step for her in the morning. She'd leave a plate of food covered on the table if he was late coming in from the fields. It was a conversation of small kindnesses. But the unease never left him. He saw how she jumped if a door slammed, how she always stood with her back to a wall, like she was afraid of being cornered. One afternoon, he was coming back from the barn and saw her at the well. She slipped on a patch of mud. As she caught herself, her sleeve slid up her arm, and he saw it. A dark, ugly bruise, the color of a dying storm cloud blooming on her pale skin. She saw him see it. Her face went blank, a shutter slamming down. She yanked the sleeve down, her movements jerky and panicked. I bumped the door frame, she stammered, not looking at him, and practically ran back into the house. Jeb stood frozen, the bucket of feed forgotten in his hand. It wasn't a door frame. He knew that mark. He'd seen marks like that on his own mother's arms when he was a boy, back when his father's temper was fueled by whiskey. A rage, cold and clean, flared in his chest. Not at her. At the ghost she was running from. He had been too small to stop it then. He was not small now. He went into town for supplies a few days later. The whispers followed him down the dusty main street. That's Kane, the one who took in that strange woman. Sheriff Cole Anders met him on the porch of the Mercantile. Cole was a good man, but he had the worried eyes of someone who'd seen too much trouble. "Jeb," he said, his voice low. "Heard you got a new cook." "Rose," Jeb said, his voice flat. Cole chewed on his lip. "Folks are talking. They say she's the one who used to be with Carter Hale." The name meant nothing to Jeb, but the way Cole said it, it felt like a curse. "Fella's got a reputation," Cole went on. "A mean one. And he's got friends in high places. Word is he's been asking around, looking for a woman who ran off." Cole spat into the dust. "A man like that, he doesn't take kindly to being left. He sees a woman not as a partner, but as property." Jeb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He bought his supplies and rode home, the sheriff's words echoing in his head. Property. That night, a real storm rolled in, the thunder rattling the windows. Jeb sat at his table, cleaning a rifle he hadn't touched in years. Rose moved around the kitchen, her silence louder than the rain. The lightning flashed, and in the stark white light, he saw her face. It was a mask of pure terror. He knew then. The ghost had a name. Carter Hale. And he was coming. The knock on the door came a week later. Not a polite rap. A hard, arrogant bang, like someone who owned the place. Scout erupted in a fury of barks, his hackles raised. Rose, who was kneading dough at the kitchen table, went still as a statue, her hands covered in flour, all the color drained from her face. Jeb put a hand on Scout's neck to quiet him and walked to the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. He could feel it. The air itself had turned sour. He opened the door. The man standing on his porch was handsome, well-dressed, with a smile that didn't touch his cold, empty eyes. It was a predator's smile. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He looked past Jeb, his eyes locking on Rose in the kitchen. "I'm Carter Hale. I've come to collect my wife." Jeb felt Rose flinch behind him. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his body. "She's not your wife, and you're not welcome here." Hale's smile tightened. "That's where you're wrong. The law says she is, and what she took from me, well, that makes her a thief too." He held up a piece of paper, a warrant, signed by a judge from 3 counties over. "She stole a significant amount of my money. I'm here to take her back to stand trial. Or, you can hand her over, and I'll be on my way. Your choice, rancher." Jeb looked from the warrant to Rose's terrified face. She was shaking her head, her eyes pleading with him. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. But the paper looked real. Hale had the law on his side. He had turned her into a criminal. This wasn't just about a brute chasing a woman. It was a trap, and Jeb had just walked right into the middle of it. Carter Hale's eyes gleamed with triumph. He had Jeb cornered, and he knew it. A legal warrant was a powerful weapon in the West, more powerful than a gun. "See, Kane," Hale said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're a simple man. You see a damsel in distress. But you don't see the whole picture. My Rose is a cunning thing. She ran off with nearly $5,000 of my money." He gestured to the house. "Probably has it stashed in there somewhere." Jeb looked back at Rose. She was still frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. $5,000? It was an impossible sum, more money than Jeb saw in a year. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it was a lie. But how could he prove it? "You're a liar," Jeb said, his voice a low growl. Hale laughed. "Am I? Ask the judge who signed this. Ask the men I have waiting back in Dry Creek. I have witnesses who saw her take the cash box. You're harboring a fugitive, Kane, an accomplice. That's a serious crime." He let the words hang in the air. "Give her to me, and I'll forget you were ever involved. Try to be a hero, and I'll see you rot in a cell right next to her." The threat was real. Jeb owned this land, but he wasn't above the law. If Hale pressed this, he could lose everything: his ranch, his freedom. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. How could he fight this? And then he saw it. A tiny movement from Rose. She was still standing by the table, her hands white with flour, but her eyes weren't filled with fear anymore. They were burning with a cold, hard anger. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a command. Don't believe him. Something shifted in Jeb. The fear was replaced by a stubborn resolve. He had offered this woman shelter. He had seen the marks on her skin. He had heard the terror in her voice during the storm. This man, Carter Hale, was evil. And Jebediah Kane would not hand another living soul over to evil. Not on his land. Not while he was still breathing. "Get off my property," Jeb said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a granite boulder. Hale's smile finally vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. He had expected Jeb to fold. He wasn't used to being told no. "You'll regret this, you ignorant sodbuster. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "And you have no idea who you're dealing with," Jeb countered, taking another step onto the porch. He was a full head taller than Hale, and twice as broad. For the first time, a flicker of unease showed in Hale's eyes. "This isn't over," Hale hissed, backing away from the steps. He pointed a finger at Jeb, his hand trembling with rage. "I'll be back, and I'll bring the law with me, the real law. We'll tear this place apart until we find my money, and when we do, I'll own this ranch. I'll own everything you have." He spun around, stormed back to his horse, and rode off in a cloud of dust, his threats lingering in the air like poison. Jeb closed the door, the sound of the latch echoing in the sudden silence. He turned to Rose. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear. "He's lying," she whispered. "There was no money, not like that." "I know," Jeb said. "But the warrant, the witnesses?" "He bought them," Jeb said simply. "A man like that, with his kind of influence, can buy anything he wants. Judges, sheriffs, witnesses. He's built a cage of lies, and he's trying to drag you back into it." Rose sagged against the table, the fight going out of her for a moment. "Then what can we do? We can't fight the law." "That paper isn't the law," Jeb said, his voice firm. "It's just a weapon, and he's not the only one who has one." He walked over to the fireplace, prying a loose stone from the hearth. He reached inside and pulled out an old, dusty strongbox. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside, nestled amongst some old deeds and his father's papers, was a worn leather journal. "What is that?" Rose asked. "My father wasn't a good man," Jeb said, his voice heavy with memory. "He was hard. He was cruel sometimes. But he hated bullies more than anything, especially rich ones from back east who thought they could buy up the whole world. He had dealings with a lot of them. He wrote things down, names, deals, crimes." He pushed the journal towards her. "Carter Hale. Does that name mean anything to your family? Before you met him?" Rose stared at the journal, her brow furrowed in thought. "Hale. My father was a businessman. He lost everything. He said he was cheated by a partner, a man who ruined him and then disappeared. We never knew his full name." She trailed off, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. She looked from the journal to Jeb. "He didn't just abuse you, did he?" Jeb asked softly. "This started long before you." This is about something else. Rose's hand trembled as she reached for the journal. Carter Hale didn't just want a wife, she whispered, her voice cracking. He wanted to erase a bloodline. Mine. The world outside the small ranch house seemed to fall away. The threat wasn't just a man trying to reclaim his property. It was a conspiracy, years in the making, aimed at destroying Rose's entire family. And somehow, Jeb's own father was connected to it. The journal felt heavy in Rose's hands, the leather worn smooth by time. She opened it, her fingers tracing the faded, spidery script. Jeb's father had a methodical hand. Dates, names, locations. It was a meticulous record of the quiet corruption that ran like a dark river beneath the surface of the West. She scanned the pages, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she found it. A series of entries from over a decade ago. The name Hale was there, linked with another name, McKenna. Her father's name. It wasn't a detailed story, just notes. A land deal, a partnership, accusations of forged documents. A final chilling entry. McKenna ruined. Hale walks away with the whole valley. The law looks the other way. Money talks louder than justice. It was all there. Carter Hale hadn't just been a business partner. He had systematically destroyed her father, stealing his land, his wealth, his future. And then, years later, he had come for the only thing left. The daughter. It wasn't about love or marriage. It was about finishing the job. Erasing the last living person who carried the McKenna name, the last person who could ever lay claim to what he had stolen. Marrying her was a way to legally absorb her inheritance, to silence her forever. He took everything, Rose whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the flower on her cheek. My father died a broken man. I never knew why. I thought it was just bad luck. It wasn't bad luck, Jeb said, his voice grim. It was a snake, and he's been coiled in the grass all this time, waiting. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more monstrous than either of them could have imagined. Hale's obsession with her, his relentless pursuit, the legal cage he'd built. It was all part of a long, patient plan. The warrant for theft was a smokescreen. He didn't want money. He wanted her. Silenced. Or dead. But what did I take? Rose said, her mind racing. He accused me of stealing. It has to be a lie he can prove, something to make the warrant stick. She thought back to the night she fled. She had grabbed a small bag with her clothes, a few keepsakes, nothing of value, nothing worth $5,000. She emptied the contents of her carpet bag onto the table. A change of clothes, a hairbrush, a small worn photograph of her parents, and a small ornate music box, a gift from her mother. It was pretty, but it was old and the paint was chipped. It couldn't be worth more than a few dollars. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It hadn't worked in years. She had kept it only for sentimental value. Jeb watched her, his brow furrowed. He reached out and took the box gently from her hands. It was heavier than it looked. He ran his thumb along the bottom. There was a faint line in the wood, almost invisible. He pressed it. A false bottom clicked open. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was not money. It was a single folded piece of paper, a deed, the original deed to the valley Hale had stolen from her father. And tucked alongside it was a signed confession from the surveyor Hale had bribed to forge the new documents all those years ago. Rose gasped. She had no idea it was there. Her mother must have hidden it, a last desperate act of preservation, entrusting it to a daughter who didn't even know she was carrying a weapon. She had been carrying the proof of Hale's crime with her the entire time. This is what he's after, Jeb said, his voice filled with a grim understanding. This is the $5,000. This is worth more than money. This is his ruin. A sudden noise outside shattered the moment. Scout, who had been lying quietly by the hearth, sprang to his feet, a low, vicious growl rumbling in his chest. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with alarm. The sound grew louder, the steady, rhythmic beat of multiple horses, not one rider this time. A group. They were moving fast, coming for the ranch. Hale hadn't just gone back to town to wait. He had gone to gather his army. He knew where the proof was, and he was coming to take it back, by any means necessary. Jeb moved instantly. He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, his voice sharp. He moved to the front door, peering through a crack in the curtains. He could see them now. A dozen riders, maybe more, silhouetted against the setting sun. They weren't lawmen. They were hard-faced men, guns drawn, the kind of men money could buy for any dirty job. Hale was leading them, his face a mask of rage. He wasn't coming with a warrant anymore. He was coming with a posse. Rose clutched the deed and the confession to her chest. Her legs felt weak, the instinct to run screaming through her. But then she looked at Jeb. He wasn't scared. He was calm, his movements deliberate. He was standing between her and the storm. He had chosen to stand. And in that moment, she made a choice too. She was done running. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. "He thinks we're trapped," Jeb said, a cold light in his eyes. "He thinks he can burn us out, take what he wants. But he's forgotten something about this land." He looked at her. "Can you ride?" She nodded, remembering the lessons he'd given her on the gentle mare, Mercy. "Good," he said. He moved to the back of the house, pulling aside a heavy rug on the floor. Underneath was a trapdoor. "This leads to a storm cellar. It connects to an old irrigation tunnel that comes out in the dry creek bed, a quarter-mile west of here. My father built it for emergencies." He handed her a small bundle. "That's a canteen and some dried rations. The tunnel is safe. Follow it all the way to the end. Mercy is in the small corral behind the barn. She'll be hidden from them. Take her and ride for Sheriff Cole's office in Dry Creek. Give him these." He gestured to the papers in her hand. "Tell him what Hale did. Tell him he's here with a gang of hired guns attacking my ranch." "But what about you?" she cried, her heart seizing with fear. "They'll kill you." "They're going to try," Jeb said, his face grim. "My job is to give you enough time to get away, to make enough noise that they don't notice you slipping out the back. Now go. Every second counts." He didn't wait for an answer. He pushed her gently towards the trap door. She gave him one last, desperate look, her eyes filled with a terror that was entirely for him. Then, she scrambled down the ladder into the darkness below. Jeb slid the trapdoor shut and kicked the rug back over it. Outside, Hale's voice boomed across the yard. "Kane, it's over. Send her out, or we're coming in. We'll burn this house to the ground." Jeb took a deep breath. He checked the load in his rifle. He walked to the front window, kicked out the glass, and fired a single shot over the heads of the riders. The crack of the rifle echoed across the prairie. The siege had begun. He was one man against a dozen. But he wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for her. He was buying time, with his own life as the currency. The tunnel was dark and smelled of damp earth. Rose stumbled forward, one hand on the rough-hewn wall, the other clutching the precious papers. Above her she could hear the muffled thunder of gunshots. Each one was a hammer blow to her heart. Jeb was up there, alone, facing a dozen men. For her. The thought propelled her forward, her fear for him overriding her own. She finally saw a sliver of light and scrambled out of the tunnel into the dry creek bed. The sounds of the fight were fainter here, carried on the wind. She crept along the embankment, staying low until she reached the small, hidden corral. Mercy, the dappled gray mare, whinnied softly at her approach. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the saddle, her mind replaying Jeb's calm, resolute face. He was sacrificing himself, and she was his only chance. She swung herself into the saddle, a clumsy, desperate movement, and urged the horse into a gallop, heading not for the main road, but across the open prairie, a longer but safer route to town. The ranch house disappeared behind a rise, but the sound of gunfire still echoed in her mind. Ride, she told herself. Ride like you've never ridden before. Back at the ranch, Jeb was making his stand. He moved from window to window, a ghost in his own home, firing sparingly, making them think there was more than one person inside. A bullet ripped through the wall next to his head, showering him with splinters. Another shattered the lamp on the kitchen table, plunging the room into darkness. They were getting closer, growing bolder. Carter Hale was screaming orders, his voice raw with fury. "He's just one man! Spread out! Flank the barn! I want him alive! I want him to watch as I drag her out of there!" Jeb smiled grimly in the dark. "She's not in there, you fool. He just had to hold on. Hold on until she made it." A new sound reached him. The crackle of flames. They had set the barn on fire. The orange glow began to fill the windows of the house. Smoke started to curl under the door. They were trying to smoke him out. Time was running out. Rose rode harder, urging Mercy on, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. The lights of Dry Creek finally appeared on the horizon, a tiny cluster of hope in the vast darkness. She didn't slow down. She galloped straight down the main street, a wild, frantic figure, pulling the horse to a skidding halt in front of the sheriff's office. She practically fell from the saddle, stumbling up the steps and bursting through the door. Sheriff Cole Anders was at his desk. He looked up, his eyes widening in shock at her disheveled state. "It's Hale," she gasped, shoving the deed and the confession into his hands. "He's at the Kane Ranch. He's got a dozen men with him. They're trying to kill Jeb." Cole took one look at the papers, his face going pale as he read the names, the dates, the surveyor's confession. The rumors, the whispers, they all snapped into focus. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a crime that went back years, and Carter Hale was at the center of it. "Wyatt!" Cole bellowed, rising from his desk and grabbing his shotgun from the wall. His deputy, a young, eager man named Wyatt, appeared from the back room. "Get every able-bodied man you can find. Deputize them. We've got a war on our hands at the Kane Ranch." He turned to Rose, his expression hard as stone. "You did the right thing, ma'am. Now stay here. You're safe." "No," Rose said, her chin lifting, her eyes blazing with a fire he'd never seen before. "I'm going with you." Cole started to argue, but he saw the look on her face and knew it was useless. This wasn't a victim anymore. This was a woman coming to claim her justice. The fire in the barn raged, casting terrifying, dancing shadows across the ranch yard. The heat was becoming unbearable inside the house. Jeb coughed, his eyes stinging from the smoke. Hale's men were closing in, using the fire as cover. He was down to his last few bullets. He could hear them at the back door, the splintering of wood as they tried to break it down. It was over. But he had bought her the time. He hoped it was enough. He retreated to the center of the main room, his back against the thick hearth, his rifle ready. He would not die cowering. He would die on his feet, defending his home. The back door crashed open. Figures silhouetted by the firelight poured in. At the same moment, the front door burst open. But it wasn't Hale's men. It was Sheriff Cole Anders, shotgun leveled. "Drop your weapons! You're all under arrest!" Hale's men, caught between Jeb and the law, hesitated, confused. From outside came the shouts of the newly formed posse, the townsmen of Dry Creek, armed and ready. They were surrounded. Carter Hale, who had been leading the charge through the back, stopped dead in his tracks, his face a picture of disbelief. And then he saw her. Rose was standing just behind the sheriff, her face smudged with dirt, her hair wild, but her eyes were locked on his. And there was no fear in them, only judgment. In that moment, Hale knew he had lost. The trap he had so carefully constructed had snapped shut. But on him, not on her. His reign of terror was over, his face contorted in a mask of pure animalistic rage. He wasn't going to prison. He wasn't going to let them win. He raised his pistol, not at the sheriff, not at Jeb, but at Rose. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. It all happened in a split second. The sheriff yelled. Jeb lunged forward, but they were too far away. A single gunshot cracked through the smoky air. It wasn't from Hale's gun. It wasn't from the sheriff's. Carter Hale staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark red stain was spreading across his fine white shirt. He collapsed to the floor, dead. Everyone froze, turning to the source of the shot. Standing in the doorway, half hidden by the smoke, was Lahi Bell, the saloon singer. She held a small, pearl-handled derringer in her hand, the barrel still smoking. Her face was calm, her sequin shawl glittering in the firelight. She looked at Rose, then at Jeb, and gave a small, sad smile. "Some men," she said, her voice soft but clear, "just don't know when to leave a girl alone." The fight was over. The hired guns threw down their weapons, hands in the air. The townsmen rushed in to secure them. The fire in the barn was roaring, but the house was safe. Jeb stood in the middle of the chaos, smoke and silence swirling around him. He looked at Rose, who was staring at Lahi Bell with stunned gratitude. Then he looked at the body of Carter Hale on his floor. The ghost was finally gone. Days later, a fragile peace settled over the Kane Ranch. The burned-out skeleton of the barn was a stark reminder of the battle, but the house stood strong. The legal mess was being sorted out. With the deed, the confession, and the testimony of half the town, Rose's claim to her family's valley was undeniable. Carter Hale's empire, built on lies and theft, was crumbling. The townsfolk, who had once whispered about Rose, now treated her with a quiet respect. She wasn't the trouble that had come to town. She was the truth. Lahi Bell's actions were ruled self-defense, a fact no one in Dry Creek was inclined to argue. She had become a local legend overnight. But the real change was at the ranch. The silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of loneliness, but the comfortable silence of companionship. Jeb and Rose worked side by side, rebuilding the barn, tending the garden, mending the fences that had been broken in the fight. They didn't talk much about what had happened. They didn't need to. The truth of it lived in the way they moved around each other, in the easy glances, the shared smiles. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. Scout lay at Jeb's feet, his head resting on Rose's shoe. "I never thanked you," Rose said quietly, her eyes on the horizon, "for everything." Jeb didn't look at her. He just kept watching the sky. "Didn't do it for thanks," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I'm thanking you." She reached out and put her hand on his. It was a big, calloused hand, scarred from years of hard work. But his touch was gentle as he wrapped his fingers around hers. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but something deeper. Partnership, trust, a promise of a shared future. He had stood for her, and in doing so, he had found the one thing his empty ranch had always been missing: a reason for it all. She had run from a monster, and in the process, she had found the one place she was never meant to leave. Two broken souls, lost in the vast empty prairie, had found their way home, together. The land was still big, but it wasn't lonely anymore. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the shadows of the past.